Okay guys, welcome to the lesson about decorating techniques. So I'm going to show you some basic decorating techniques that just require using tools and clay. So nothing fancy, but you can do a lot with a little with this. Firstly, we're going to look at options for decorating your clay when it's still soft. So you've just made a piece and it's still soft and malleable. So the first thing you can do is using tools to press into the surface. So just taking the tools that you should have in your tool pack, the pencil tool and the lollipop stick. You can do a lot already using the pencil tool. For example, if I just use the end, I can make marks using the tip of the pencil. So a lot of these mark makings can be really effective when they're done consistently, so in a pattern or a repeated sequence or something like that. That can work really effectively. Also, if you use the pencil on its edge like this, you'll get some variation on the shape. And again, with something like that, if I overlap it, I can start getting some quite interesting repeat patterns in the surface of my piece. There's also the back end of the pencil for making different marks. If you find that any part of your tool is sticking to the clay and picking it up, it might be worth just waiting a little bit for the clay to be less tacky, and then you should get a cleaner impression in there. It generally only happens if you're pressing something non-porous into the clay. For example, the back of this pencil is coated in paint, or if I were to use something metal, it might catch the clay a bit when it's wet. And the other tool is the lollipop stick. So I like doing patterns like putting my finger on the top of it and using the edge of it, so kind of pushing into the clay and across the surface of the clay, and that can make some quite nice patterns. I used to make owl pots and things like that using this technique for making feathers, like so. Also, I've actually cut the other end of my lollipop stick to make a flat edge that isn't too hard to do if you just sort of saw into it with a serrated knife, being really careful not to saw into your own hand. You can flatten the end off, and then you can do other kind of variations, so using the end like that, or using the corner of it, pressing like so. It's fun to practice on a spare bit of clay, and then you might come up with some interesting patterns and sequences, and then you can put them onto your pot. So that's using tools to press in. The next option I was going to show you is adding to the texture using a fork or your serrated kidney. Well, there's lots of different stuff you can use, combs, different types of cake profilers. It's good to have a rummage around in your kitchen and see if you've got anything that might make interesting impressions or textures in there. You'll be surprised what you'll find if you've got that kind of mindset. So with the rib here, I can just do different kind of combing patterns, which is quite satisfying to do. and those textures will be picked up really nicely when the pot's glazed. The glaze pulls in the recesses of the clay, and it can be really effective. Also using the fork, you'll just get a bolder kind of mark on there, like so. With texturing like this, what I normally do is I'll add a texture to the surface when it's soft, and when the clay is not quite fully dried but almost dry, I'll just run a damp sponge over it, which will just take off any sharp burrs and edges. If you try and do it when the clay is too soft, you'll smudge your design, so it's best to wait till it's a bit firmer. So the last thing for working with soft clay and applying decoration is making your own stamps. So I've got a few offcuts here that I left from when I was working on the last class, and you can do it with bone dry pieces of clay. All you have to do is cut a piece of clay like this, or a coil, let it go dry, and then if you get a damp sponge and just sort of wipe it over the edge, just to dampen the clay slightly, you can then start using your metal scraper and what else was I using? Your needle tool to actually scratch and scrape a design into the end of this, and then you can use that as a stamp basically. So for example with this one, I can scratch the end to make sure that it's nice and flat, scratch the edges to any shape I want. So if you want there to be a flat end on there, what you can do is use this edge and kind of chip away at the edge of the clay until you've got the shape that you want. If you scrape it off in little bits and keep adding slight damp sponge to it, it'll stop it being too brittle and chalky, and also it'll reduce the amount of dust that's produced, which we're trying to avoid when we're working with clay. So always keep things slightly damp. So I'll flatten that edge off, and then if I want I can scratch using my needle tool, scratch a design into it like so, being careful not to scratch through my finger as well. So I've got my stamp design scratched here, and you can actually use this without firing the clay first. You can just press it into the clay, and you're basically making your own stamp design. And if you press it into a scrap piece of clay, you can figure out if you need to, for example, make the grooves deeper or wider to make it bolder, or tweak your stamp design. So normally what I do when I make my own stamps like this, I'll fire them in the kiln and then use them, because then once they're fired in the kiln you can just use them forever. But if this is your first project at home, what you could do is you can make your stamps like this, and you can actually use them when they're bone dry. So I can just start stamping using a couple of stamps I've made, and already the clay's hard enough that you can stamp into it without it breaking. So that's how you make your own stamps to press into the clay. And the next section we're going to be working with decorating onto leather hard clay.